Professor Hall, thank you very much for making yourself available this morning after a very busy weekend and a late-night flight to Cape Town yesterday. Firstly, overriding sense from you of this land summit. In your view, was it a good summit?
Well, I think that it was a very serious summit. What I was struck by is that people across the board were engaging in issues of detail. Let's be clear that the summit didn't only focus on the question of land expropriation without compensation. In fact, there were commissions that dealt with that issue of the property clause in the Constitution, but we also had specific sessions and commissions on land redistribution, on land restitution, on agrarian reform, on communal tenure, on farm tenure and on urban tenure. So it was quite broad in its scope. And I think that, you know, the participation was broad. There were members of the National Executive Committee, very many of them, the majority I would imagine, plus members of Parliament and alliance partners. And what I would say was quite unique about this particular event is that an internal ANC workshop opened itself out to outsiders, people like myself, other academics, lawyers, NGOs, activists who work on these land issues. So the ANC was acknowledging, I think, and sending a signal that it does not have a monopoly on knowledge and experience around land issues, and it was asking for input from outside to build a more robust debate. So I think it was a good summit.
Yeah, and as you always remind us when we talk to you on ANC about issues of land, you cannot talk about land in South Africa without focusing on various aspects like the rural side of it. And as you said, I mean, there was discussion on urban land access and tenure, the farmlands and tenure, and of course communal tenure. And I've seen reports that discussion around the communal tenure caused a little bit of controversy.
Well, yes, and this is in the public domain. Of course, the ANC will report later today, and I will not comment about the commissions or the outcomes of those commissions and the report backs. That, in fact, will become more clear later today, and also after the National Executive Committee meets this coming weekend. There will be a firm position developed, and that is the position that the ANC will take into the parliamentary process. But yes, I think that it's fair to say that we covered a good range of topics. The issue around communal tenure is clearly one of the most controversial. In the opening session, which has been reported and is in the public domain, former President Kgalema Motlanthe specifically spoke about the issue of communal tenure and the role of traditional authorities. There's been some furor in the media over his argument that, in fact, some traditional leaders are acting as what he called village tin pot dictators, treating the land as if it's theirs and entering into corrupt mining deals. And of course, this is a controversial issue. It was discussed. And I think that what Motlanthe did, which was very constructive, is that he provided an overview of what his high-level panel research findings were. And so he was able to say, on restitution, this is how we've done. On redistribution, this is how we've done. On farm tenure, and so on. And what I think was interesting is that in the opening address, the President said, our constitution doesn't seem to be the main obstacle to land reform. In fact, it's a mandate for transformation. And then the former President Motlanthe got up and said, we've looked into what's been done over the past 20 years, and in fact, we have failed to honor this mandate for transformation. So I think that was a very interesting dynamic, with the ANC acknowledging that, in fact, it's not done well. I think there's a lot of honesty now within the ANC that it has failed to deal with this. But interestingly, President Ramaphosa, in his opening address, linked that back to the history of the ANC and said, we're coming back to our roots. Because the ANC was, of course, founded on the eve of the promulgation of the 1913 Natives Land Act. And he says, what is the ANC if we do not address and confront this issue? And of course, this was also in the presence of advocate Tembeka Nqulkatobi, whose famous book, The Land is Ours, traces the history of black lawyers who were fighting against the Natives Land Act. So, you know, I think that there was a lot of agreement in the room that this is a historic imperative. The ANC has largely failed to honor its mandate for transformation that does already exist within the Constitution, and that the questions are about what do we do now?
Yes, I think that question of what do we do now is top of mind from or anybody who's following this very closely, and we are waiting to hear with the outcomes what will be the next steps. But acknowledging that there's been a lack of progress in land reform is one thing, because, I mean, one of the actions one would hope is that there's going to be effective implementation of the policies. And on the other hand, there's a legal framework here that needs to be discussed, because there is now in the House of, in the National Assembly, in Parliament, there is now that bill, that process of whether or not to change Section 25 of the Constitution for purposes of expropriation of land without compensation. But as you referred to him earlier, Advocate Nugai Tobi is reported to have said, no, you don't need to do that. Actually, it's just a question of passing new legislation to bring that into effect.
Well, exactly. And one of the things that the advocate said, which I think caught many people unawares, is he said, not only does the Constitution provide for expropriation, and if it's just inequitable, that can be expropriation with no compensation. It's already in the Constitution. But in fact, our common law also provides for that. So there are court judgments dating back to 1915, 1988. There are precedents in South African common law that say where justifiable there can be no compensation. So it seems that we're sitting with three options, really. Either we retain the status quo, and I think that nobody really thinks that that's a tenable situation, or maybe some do, but I think that within the ANC that probably won't be a very popular route. The other is we actually amend Section 25, and it's a bit unclear what we would change, because already Section 25(2) says you can expropriate for land reform purposes. Section 25(3) just says compensation must be just and equitable. It could be Section 25(3) that could be amended. But bear in mind there's also a clause, Section 25(8) of the Property Clause, which says no provisions may impede the state from taking action to bring about transformation. So it really doesn't look like we do need to amend the Constitution. A third option between amending the Constitution and doing nothing would be to expedite the expropriation bill. Now, this bill has been languishing for a while. It in fact brings our expropriation legislation in line with Section 25, so it would be entirely constitutional. But perhaps that expropriation bill should clarify what should be done. There's another very interesting proposal, which is that we should have a new law that says what constitutes equitable access to land, because increasingly people are saying the problem is not just the state doesn't have enough power, but that citizens don't have enough power to hold the state to account. And perhaps, since there is a right of equitable access to land already in the Property Clause, we should have a law that says how should the state respond when people say they want land? What is its accountability to citizens? Who should it prioritize? Should the poor be prioritized or not, you know? And so I think that there are two possible alternatives. Perhaps we should be pursuing the expropriation bill and going with a new kind of land reform bill that would clarify equitable access to land, and at the same time, as the Minister said last week, introduce some test cases, start to move ahead and get some constitutional court judgments that provide certainty, which I think is in everyone's interests.
Now, Prof, I'm going to put you on the spot. I've never done this before, but we're going to hear the outcomes from the ANC's Land Summit later today. I'll be fascinated to hear your views on those outcomes if you could talk to us tomorrow morning.
Sure, I'm very happy to, but I don't want to talk about outcomes. It was an ANC event. It's not up to me to report outcomes. But no. I'm happy to comment on them once they're out. Yeah, the ANC is reporting the outcomes today, but I'm asking you if you could comment on them afterwards, and that you could join us again tomorrow morning here on Morning News Today. That's why I said I was putting you on the spot. It would be a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Professor Ruth Hall from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape.